Hello, this is Todd from TT Bike Fit once again, continuing our series on Kona pro triathlete cycling positions and looking at the different bike fits and how they compare. And today we're going to look at the some of the top women, and what we want to do here is compare and contrast the differences between some of the top 10 women in on the bike. And you can see with this group of 4 that we picked here that there's quite a bit of variation in their fits. And you don't really have to be an expert to see that essentially the profile of each of these riders looks quite different as they pass me out here on the Queen K. We have Michelle Vesterby here, Liz Blatchford, Dr. Amanda Stevens, and Jodie Swallow. And so these riders all had different outcomes in their races. Of course, Liz was third, Jodie DNF'd, Michelle had a pretty good race, and Amanda Stevens had a reasonably good race as well too. But they were all in fairly early on the bike into T2, top 10 riders. So it becomes immediately apparent when you look at these 4 riders next to each other like this, that when you look at Michelle and Jodie, for instance, they look very flat and very aero. So, this is where we get into the terminology where someone says, well, they have an aggressive position. Well, what do we really mean by that? Typically an aggressive position refers to a rider being lower and likely in association with that being more forward relative to the bottom bracket. If you saw either of my videos on the men, you notice that most of them were sitting very far forward relative to the bottom bracket. If we look at where their sit bones are relative to the bottom bracket, they're way up there. If you consider that the typical tri-bike is built on about a 78-degree angle, that's often the most forward you can get the clamp for the saddle. A lot of these riders are sitting a lot further forward. So that's part of being aggressive, and we'll talk some more about why that is, why they'd be doing that. But then if you look at these other 2 riders, if you look at Liz and Amanda Stevens here, they certainly don't look at first glance to be as aerodynamic or as low or as aggressive than these other 2 riders. So they appear to be a lot more upright. That would be the first thing that you would notice. Interestingly, however, as far as the seat angle is concerned, as far as how forward they're sitting relative to the bottom bracket, we can see that in Liz's case here, she's sitting very far forward relative to the bottom bracket. She's got the saddle clamp as far forward as it'll go on this bike that's built at 78, plus the clamp is slid forward. She's got the saddle jammed as far forward as it'll go, and then she's up here on the nose. So she's way up here, like around 86 degrees or something like that, measured on her sit bones. If we look at Amanda Stevens, who certainly looks to be the most upright of any of these cyclists, we're at a little bit of a strange angle here as far as the way I'm shooting her with the camera, but still she's sitting quite far forward, even though she's very upright on the bike. So, normally or frequently, when we talk about aggressive positions, a forward saddle position, forward seat angle, sitting very steep, as these riders all are, is associated with a very low and aggressive position. However, here we see what appears to be a not very aggressive position at all, a very upright position, being associated with still a very steep seating position. And same with Liz's position here as well. So, this is one of the reasons we tend to reject the notion that the seat angle itself is correlated directly to how low the rider is in front or how much drop they're going to use down to the bars in front. Certainly, all things being equal, If you drop a rider lower in front, they tend to want to be steeper to open the hip angle more. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that a rider who's not low in front doesn't require a steep seat angle. So, what are some of the reasons, potential reasons, why, we see these, what are very aggressive positions here versus far less aggressive positions? Certainly, you don't really need a wind tunnel to see that, Amanda Stevens' position here is going to be less aerodynamic than Jodie or Michelle's position. And Liz is going to likely, according to my eyeball wind tunnel, which of course is not always correct, but is not bad at estimating what aerodynamic drag is going to be. Liz is going to fall somewhere into the middle here. A lot of the differences in these riders' positions has to do with their range of motion and where they are flexible. So we hear about flexibility discussed as far as, I'm not very flexible, so I can't be very aggressive, or, I am flexible, so I should be able to get very aggressive on the bike. Well, that's a little bit too general. The question is, where do you have that range of motion, and how does that range of motion function to, will that function to allow you to get very low in front comfortably and still be able to generate power and be comfortable? So the biggest difference when you look at someone like Michelle here and someone like Liz, if we start out with their degree of pelvic tilt, and so if I'm looking at approximate sacral angle there, that gives me an idea of how tilted the rider is on their pelvis. So neither of these riders is particularly tilted. When I mean tilted, that means rolling the pelvis further forward, and this would have a shallower angle. When you see riders that tilt a great bit, they're down in the 30s typically on this measure. Riders who are the other end of the extreme tend to be up into the 50s. So with both of these riders, we see them being somewhere in the middle, what I consider just a moderate amount or middle of the road amount of pelvic tilt. But the interesting thing is that you'll see how darn flat Michelle's back looks there. In fact, she's actually almost sloping downhill as far as her torso angle. So that's one thing we're always going to look at. We're going to try to look at what angle is the torso actually sitting at, because this is going to affect to some extent the rider's frontal area, of course. There's a lot more to the drag equation than just the frontal area or just how low or flat the rider gets, but it's certainly one major factor. So she's almost at a downhill slope on her torso angle, as is Jodie. But yet she starts at the same approximate pelvic tilt angle as Liz. Difference being the degree of flexion in the spine here, so that right here in the lower back, Michelle is able to essentially, flex her spine and go from being upright at 46 degrees to being dead horizontal in the space of just a couple of vertebrae right there. So she's got this spinal flexibility that allows her to be very flat when the front end of the bike is low. Liz, on the other hand, does not have that. So you'll see that basically she's got no spinal flexion, more or less, for a large, till we get somewhere in the middle region of her spine, and then we start to see some gentle curvature take place. Not the dramatic, 45, 50 degree bend we see take place in the space of a couple of vertebrae, but more of a gentle curvature. So the point is that you could put someone like Liz on a fit bike, for example, an automated fit bike like we have at TT Bike Fit, and drop the front end of her bike. And what will happen is that with a rider like this, frequently they're not going to get any more aero. They're not going to appear to be any more aero as you drop the front end, because essentially they're at the limit of their range of spinal flexibility. They're at the limit as far as how much they can tilt their pelvis. There's only really two ways that a rider can comfortably get lower as you drop the front end. One is to roll the pelvis further forward, and two is to flex the spine more. Now, the shoulders will come into play too, in that riders at some point are going to start protracting those shoulders forward, and that generally at some point leads to discomfort. So it's actually something that we don't generally like to see, at least for long course athletes. But the point being that no matter what you did to this rider's fit, this may be about as quote unquote aggressive or aero looking as she can possibly get, due to the flexibility that she has. What we do see with her position, though, even though the pelvic region and lower lumbar spine area looks fairly upright, that if you look at the front of her torso, she's gotten it pretty darn flat. And of course, that has a lot to do with what the wind is actually seeing. So she's done an effective job here of getting the front of her torso pretty flat, even though she's fairly rounded in the back, and at first glance looks to be fairly upright. This may in fact be the most effective position for her. Amanda Stevens, on the other hand, I think she falls into the same category here, would be my guess, but I question whether she couldn't improve her position to some extent. She's certainly not doing ourselves any favor from an aero perspective here. So even though she was up there on the bike, she's always one of the faster swimmers, so she gets out of the water first, or close to the front. But she's certainly working a lot harder here at a given speed than she needs to overcome aerodynamic drag. I believe that if you look at the approximate front of her torso here, it's curved obviously, but we are at a fairly upright slope in the 20 degrees. That is generally very poor from an aero perspective. Now, it remains to be seen how much that can be improved, and where her limits are. Again, putting her on an automated fit bike is going to be one of the best ways to determine this. But I believe that with the proper adjustment of stack and reach in front, that she could probably be improved. In this case, we might be looking at a situation where she's limited by the chosen bicycle. This is a Blue Triad SL, and it looks to me to be set maxed down, although I can't really see the spacers here. So, but based on what I can see, the aero bars on this bike, the proprietary aero bars, are already fairly low. The pads, the cups are essentially right down on the base bar, so it's a low stack aero bar to start out with, and then you have the proprietary stem is nearly horizontal. So even though this is a higher stack bike frame design, with the proprietary front end that comes on the SL, it ends up being a fairly low back, or fairly low stack bike net, and there are spacers that can be put under the stem, but to me it looks like she may have none. So the point of the matter is that she may not be able to get any lower on this bike than she is. We still don't absolutely know whether that's appropriate or not, but again, my guess is that it is. If we go, besides the torso angle that we talked about here and being more upright, when essentially her shoulders are this high above the saddle, the head ends up being quite high. So you've got most of the head up above the back, and so there's just a lot more frontal area going down the road than there might be otherwise. If we shift our focus to the two, aggressive low riders here, and certainly Caroline Steffen would fit into this category as well. She's set up very similar to these two. The question I have with either of these riders is whether they haven't slightly overdone it to some extent. Okay, there's a limit, there's certainly diminishing returns to, how low the rider should be in front, especially for long course. I wonder if, looking at these riders, if the front end was raised a bit, whether it would have very little effect on their torso angle, very little effect on their aerodynamics, but actually improve their comfort quite a bit, and possibly, improve their power output as far as opening this hip angle up a little bit. Both of these riders being sloped down, to a negative extent, essentially, in the torso is it's quite extreme. And so, you need a rider like this needs to have some clearance between the thigh at the top of the pedal stroke and the torso. And the way to do that is to get more forward. The other way to do that is shorten the cranks. Finally, the other way to do that is to actually raise the torso a little bit. And so there's, that's where I would come out on these riders. Do they really need to be set up as aggressively as they are? Would they run better off the bike, for example, if they were set up a little aggressively and a little less aggressively, and it might not hurt their bike splits one iota? Looking at her thigh angle here, if the bike's tipped down about 1 degree at about 24 degrees, that's not bad, but she's way the heck up there, at 86 degrees or 87 degrees even to get that. So, and her crank arms don't look to me to be particularly short. So, this is an example of shorter cranks might be a good thing. A little more height in the front end might be a good thing. Her shoulders are protracted down a bit here. Her shoulders might come up a little bit. Might improve comfort, might improve breathing, might improve running off the bike and not make her any slower in her bike split. I consider Michelle to be a little less aggressively positioned, but still very much so. And if we try to get into that thigh angle, the question becomes, once again, we see a similar angle, even though that she's sort of coming up the road here, so it's not a perfect measure. But, once again, just because the rider has the ability, has the range of motion to ride this tight at the top of the pedal stroke, this tight between torso and thigh, should they? And this is where we get into the question of, okay, well, before a bike fit, let's test the rider's range of motion. Let's throw them on a table and do various tests on them. Great, we get an angle that we can refer to. But the point is, just because they have that range of motion, should they be set up to the limit of that on the bike? And again, we think typically not. So one more situation where, possibly, another centimeter or two height in front here, possibly a notch shorter on the cranks might open things up a little more, not hurt the bike split at all, and make it that much easier to run off the bike. A couple other quick things we can look at on these riders, just as far as saddle height's concerned. There's a range of saddle heights we can see relative to knee angle and foot angle. And even though by the time Michelle Hood gets her leg down, she's riding away from us, so that distorts this a little bit. She's set up quite high because we see a fairly straight knee angle there at the bottom of the pedal stroke. So, definitely she appears, from what we can tell, to be set up, relatively high on the saddle, especially when we consider that she's also sitting, once again, to get steep, quite a bit forward on the saddle. When we look at Liz here, she looks like a more typical knee angle, a more middle of the range knee angle. A couple ways to look at it, but more typical, closer to the center of the range that we want to see, and along with a more typical foot angle, toe down somewhere in, say, the low 20s, the bottom of the pedal stroke. So that all looks, very standard there. No problem with it at all. from what we can see, Jodie appears to be at the higher end of the spectrum. And Amanda Stevens definitely appears to be at the low end of the spectrum. So this is the best shot we can get here of her knee angle. And it looks like there's, she's coming towards us still. So not a perfect measure once again, but we're seeing what looks to be a very low saddle there based on that angle. And certainly, she's way up on the nose like we see here. So we have kind of the opposite situation where she's way up on the nose. Getting up on the nose is going to effectively lower your saddle height. So she may be at a very middle of the range saddle height when she's sitting back, but she gets way up there on the nose, and now she finds herself at a low saddle height. Whereas with Michelle, she's probably set up extremely high when she's sitting back, and she's moderately high when she slides forward. So now we want to switch to looking at a couple of riders that I'm going to put in the penalty box here. And on the left we have Caroline Steffen and Rachel Joyce. And I put Rachel up here as an example of a very solid long course bike fit. Everything ticks off all the boxes. I believe she was done by Matt Steinmetz, so he certainly knows what he's doing. And it's not particularly aggressive. It's not particularly unaggressive either. It's just a very solid fit. So a lot of folks would do well to look like her here on the bike. And certainly, she was limited against being able to get more aggressive by the bike she was on. She's on a 700 wheeled bike. She's a fairly small person, so there's only so low, and you can get a bike like this. And on top of that, the P5 is not the lowest 700 wheel bike anyway, as far as the front. She's got the bars all the way down. So, partially here she was limited by what she had to ride, but I don't think in any way, this really hurt her. She still winds up with a very nice looking position. And this is an example of, Caroline up there is set up more aggressively, as I mentioned, more similar to Jodie Swallow's position. And, again, almost to the point where she looks like torso is sloping down a little bit. So this is an example of, what should be a very comfortable, very usable, and still quite fast position, and allow, good running off the bike, good power on the bike. Shouldn't really slow the bike split over, what would be a much more hyper-aggressive position here with the almost downward sloping torso angle. So the question is, again, comes out with somebody like Caroline here, does she need to be this low in front? Or if she came up to more of a position like this, would her overall race times wind up being better? But then we look at the riders that I put in the penalty box, as I mentioned. I'm not really putting Caroline there. I mean, she certainly has a fast position, but is it the most optimal? I don't know. But if we look at Amy Marsh up here first, we see an example of a position that really needs a lot of help. And first of all, she's not particularly aero. She's somewhat upright, and it looks like she possibly would have the potential to improve on that, although that's not certain again till we would work with her and see what her limits were. But she's, let's say, if we're just looking at torso angle, bikes down 1, she's upright in the low double digits. So, I mean, not the worst, certainly, but probably something that might be improved upon. But the worst thing here about her position is just her saddle height. So here we can see pretty much her at maximum extension, and that's just a very low saddle. She's just very low compared to the normal ranges. I can't imagine that she wouldn't cycle faster and more efficiently with a higher saddle. In this case, raise the saddle up keep the front end where it is and see what happens. But you know, I just don't think there's any excuse for an athlete of this caliber to be set up that low. You know, just like pretty much everybody else, she's sitting extremely forward on the saddle. Steep seat angle, no surprise there. The other one I'd put in the penalty box here this year is Mary Beth Ellis. And yeah, we all know she was injured, unfortunately, leading into this race. But you can probably see already, you know, what I'm going to say. It's the exact opposite situation. Her saddle just looks ridiculously high. So here we see she's coming at us, and she's nearly fully extended here in her knee. Now, you know, whether the injury had anything to do with any of this, I don't know. But, you know, I have a shot of her from last year, and she actually looks pretty darn high last year as well. Now, I'm not able to get a good knee angle on her because she's coming at us here, but it doesn't take, you know, we don't have to draw an angle on there to see that she's almost fully extended. And on top of that, you know, she hasn't really dropped her heel. So she still has a little bit of upward slope on the foot, even though she's fully extended like that. So, you know, another example, I don't know why an athlete of this caliber would be set up with a saddle this high. We can see that she's got downward slope of the foot. We can see almost fully extended. For a lot of people, that would cause some serious injury to somewhere on the backside of the chain. That would just, you know, on top of that, top of the injury potential, it's just hard to believe that a rider set up like this is able to maximize their power output. What happens is you start to lose the bottom of the pedal stroke, and so you are not really able to pedal well in circles as a general statement when you're set up this high, because you're fully extended, and it's very difficult to work any backward force on the pedal essentially as it comes through the bottom. So, you know, her position otherwise looks decent, but, you know, she needs to be able to achieve that position with a proper saddle height. You know, so in summary, you know, at the end here we pointed out what looked like some mistakes in bike fit setup, but on the other hand, what we really want to point out on this video is that there's you know, degrees of quote unquote aggressiveness, and you really need to figure out where your body can go naturally and effectively, and whether it should be there at its limits or not.